as someone looking at getting into open source, maintainers are just like you, and you're just like maintainers. We're not special. We don't have superpowers. We're not even really probably spending all that additional time over what you're able to spend. Really, the only difference between someone who's maintaining a project, someone who's contributing to a project, and someone who's just exploring is experience. And so that anyone can gain with a little bit of time. My name is Dave Glick. I've been professionally developing software for close to 20 years now. I started as a high schooler working for a local internet service provider, building out websites for their clients. No one else at the place knew anything about this newfangled website stuff. They had been working with dial-up modems and getting people's emails up and running. So they found me as a young high schooler down the street who knew something, and had people asking for them to build them websites. And so I kind of hooked up with that and fell in love. So I've been doing that ever since in one form or another. I was around for the first .com boom in the 90s. I was young at the time. I was in high school and then college. Open source maintainers and contributors even, they give their time for a variety of different reasons, right? And there's a whole bunch of varying motivations as to why people do that. And, a lot of folks do it for the pleasure, right? It's like a game. Some people like to play video games. To others, writing source code is like playing a video game, right? There's an aspect of creativity involved. There's problem solving. So that's, it's enjoyable. It's like reading a book for other people. So there's, that's certainly one motivation, but then you've got this whole spectrum of other motivations. Some people want to do it for recognition, credibility. Some people are even sort of thinking that maybe they'll build some sort of a side revenue stream out of that work. And one of the things I'd love to see is the open source community, and particularly among users of open source, find ways to sort of support and nourish all of those different motivations, right? And each one needs to be sort of supported in a different way. And so that's something I hope we see more of as we continue to have this dialogue about how to support maintainers. That for some maintainers, financial support is important. But if your motivation is not financial, then maybe your support looks different, right? Maybe there's some kind of support structure that's based around acknowledgement that would be more beneficial and appreciated by those folks. So, I think that's a discussion that's kind of ongoing within the open source community writ large right now. For the last maybe 5 or 6 years, my focus has been almost entirely on a static site generator called Static with a Q at the end. I like to say the Q stands for quality. So I've been in that space for a while. That's actually the predecessor to a previous project called YM that was kind of similar. And I maintain some other projects too. One is called Buildalizer, which is used in .NET Interactive kind of under the hood, and some other tools. But generally, I've come to think of the projects I work on as comprising, you might call it a portfolio, that between Static, which is kind of my big, tens of thousands of lines of code at this point, and all the supporting projects around it, they all sort of fit under this umbrella of developer tooling to generate sites or pages or other artifacts. For whatever reason, I really like that space and have gravitated towards it. So whether it's generating websites, generating build artifacts, analyzing builds, it all kind of falls under this sort of developer tooling umbrella. I've seen a variety of different contribution models in open source. I've been involved with the Cake project pretty heavily, and they kind of, in my opinion, have it down. I learned most of what I understand about how to be a good maintainer and foster a good community from the folks on that project. And so taking those lessons into my own sort of large scale open source project, I try and foster this idea that anyone can contribute and participate. And in particular, I think there's a impression amongst people kind of on the outside of open source, so maybe early contributors or folks just sort of exploring that. There's a thinking that contributing means you have to write code, that you have to write a lot of code and open up this complicated PR. And unless you're sending in this new feature, that you're not really contributing. And one of the kind of key takeaways for me over the last 3 or 4 years of working on static has been that that's entirely untrue. Static as a piece of software is fairly complex. And so I don't get a ton of contributors coming in writing large features for it kind of under the hood in that sense, because that would be hard for them to ramp up, and the time they spend on that may not be the most valuable time they could be spending. What I do get a lot of is people opening up issues with ideas and going back and forth with them on what that might look like, brainstorming what those new features would entail and how that might work and what it would be like from a user perspective. To me, on this project, that dialogue with members of the community, and I'll call them contributors, is almost more valuable than getting a bucket load of code from someone, because that sort of opens the door to exploring what's beneficial to the user base writ large, rather than just putting in this one sort of niche feature that this one person needed. So, I think the lesson learned there, and the emphasis for anyone looking at projects that they want to kind of help out with, is contributing to a project doesn't mean writing a big PR or writing any code at all, really. Contributing to the docs, contributing ideas, helping the maintainers just work through brainstorming sessions, being a rubber ducky, as they call it. All of those are extremely valuable to maintainers and to a project at large.
Absolutely.
I'm going to get into kind of a little bit of opinionated territory here. I know a lot of maintainers, one of their main goals, and this is probably partly driven by some of this motivational stuff I spoke about, where if the motivation for doing open source is rooted in, say, credibility or notoriety, and those are perfectly valid, great reasons to be doing open source. I don't want to say or make it sound like that's not a good reason to be doing this. It's a great reason to be doing this. But if those are the motivations, then increasing user numbers and increasing adoption becomes a sort of a metric by which you measure your success against those motivators. For me personally, I've come to the opinion that adoption maybe is not the best metric of success. And so I actually don't, and I kind of consciously don't do a lot to seek out new users or like do a lot of external marketing, that kind of thing. I think it's important to support the users who found the tool and find it valuable. So documentation, examples, helping people in discussions, all those are extremely important to me. But getting those user counts up and those download counts up, I don't really chase. And I feel like that's a mistake that a lot of open source projects can make, especially early on, because maintainers often don't scale with adoption, right? You've got this sort of curve happening where I think every maintainer who's ever worked on a project that's starting to get a little bit popular, you start to become terrified that it's going to get even more popular, right? The issues start rolling in, you can't keep up, you've got all these bug reports, all these PRs, and it's like, as that snowball kind of starts rolling down the hill, you had wanted the snowball to start, right? You kind of kicked it off, you wanted this avalanche, but then it starts and you're standing under the avalanche and it's like, oh crap, what have I done? So, there's this kind of delicate balance where you obviously want people to find and appreciate the work that you're doing. That's an important aspect for anyone doing this. Otherwise you wouldn't open it in the first place. But for me, I feel like I don't really want to be under the avalanche. I'm happy growing organically and slowly to keep pace with what I'm able to, do in my time as a maintainer. Open source is a loaded term. And I learned this a few years ago when I was sort of pontificating online about some of this sort of open source funding and sustainability. And, this topic comes up every 2 or 3 months. It sort of rolls through the social networking landscape and becomes a hot topic. And what I kind of learned through interacting with people is that for a lot of people, open source as a term of art means something very specific. And it means something that is closely tied to the free software movement and the open source initiative, the OSI, and approved licenses and copyleft and all of those terms. Essentially, that when a lot of people say open source, they mean that the thing is available under some sort of licensing term that is OSI approved. Now, that kind of falls under two umbrellas. There's copyright, which is essentially you can take this code and change it, but then you have to contribute back your changes or contribute back the thing that you linked it to. And then there's copyleft, which is more permissible, things like MIT licenses, where you can take this and do whatever you want with it, but the code itself is like open for your use. Now, what we're seeing is this sort of momentum around sustainability models. And so some of those models include licensing as a lever towards funding or other sustainability practices. But that's getting away from this sort of original understanding of what open source means. So I admittedly have not done a great job of trying to separate the two, but I've taken to calling this sort of broader umbrella of software openly developed software, because the idea of building a community, the idea of building it in the open, the idea of the source code being browsable and available, all those sort of core communal tenets are still there, right? It's still got this kind of open source feel to it, if not adhering to the strict understanding that a lot of people hold on to of what open source as a term means. So I felt like there's this need for another term that's a little bit broader, because we want to honor that legacy, right? I mean, there's some debate as to whether maybe the term itself should be evolving. But yeah, I think the discussions we're having end up getting caught up in that, as opposed to what we should be talking about, which is sustainability in this kind of broader context. If we keep talking about, well, what does open source mean as a term? So to me, it's easier to just sidestep that debate entirely, use a broader term like openly developed software, and then we can get on with the business of discussing things like alternate licensing schemes and does it really need to be OSI approved? What if what if you want funding for non-commercial entities as opposed to commercial, or that kind of thing? We've all been kind of dealing with a drastic change to our personal lives and how we manage our time and all that. So I started really getting heavy into open source about 6 years ago, I think. And at the time, my life was different. I had one fewer kid. I was in a different place. And so spending a huge amount of personal free time was a luxury that I had at that stage in my life. My kids weren't involved in as many activities. I wasn't volunteering as much with the stuff that they're doing. There was just more available time. And so as I've gotten older, the way in which I can allot my time and contribute to open source and open developed software has evolved and changed. And so I'm kind of in this stage right now where I've been trying to figure out what that looks like for the next 10 years. I'm finding other interests too. I find that on the weekends, my motivation for opening up code is a lot lower than it used to be. And I think that happens to everyone. What I'm exploring and I think settling on is this balance between doing enough that the projects I work on continue to evolve and continue to stay interesting, but not overdoing it to the point that I reach burnout or that it stops being fun, right? I mean, even the people who are motivated by, say, financial gain in open source, and that's totally fine if that's your thing. Everyone loves money. There's nothing wrong with that. But even those folks, you get to a point where the time you're putting in just doesn't return the value. So you have to have, there's got to be something you're getting out of it. You have to be fulfilling those motivations, right? It's a little bit like that whole hierarchy of needs
Mhm.
exercise. Working on openly developed software is way up at the top. It's not one of your core needs. And so you need to be able to meet all those core needs in order to have working on openly developed software be fulfilling. And when it stops being fulfilling, that's the recipe for burnout. That's when you lose people out of the community. So I'm trying to find that right balance so that I can continue to do it for another decade without reaching the point where I want to just step back entirely and say, I'm done. I've run my course. And I feel like that's important. It's something I think everyone has to kind of explore as they mature along their path and work on
Absolutely.
open source for a while. I love the .NET Foundation. I love what they're trying to accomplish. It's had some growing pains, which is all positive, right? It's like yeah. So kind of changing gears here for just a second with the .NET Foundation and what's been going on there over the last year. When we build software and we have people test it, we want them to find problems so that we can fix the problems to make the software better. I feel like that's the stage we're at with the foundation right now.
Mhm.
So all that is to say, I really appreciate the mission of the foundation and the folks who are working really hard to bring that to fruition. And for the projects that have gained from being a part of that umbrella, that's fantastic. I'm glad that that option exists. But at the same time, you can like and appreciate something and be involved in it and support it without saying that it has to apply to everything. I mean,
Yeah.
the time we have to give is zero sum. And I don't, even if you've got the project on GitHub with the most sponsors and whatever, unless you're one of the rare ones that becomes your full-time job. And that's like so super rare. It's like winning the lottery.
Yeah.
Our time is zero sum, right? And even
Yeah.
then, there's only so many hours in the day. So everything you do with that project, even if it's a tangent to writing code, uses up cycles that you could be using on other things. So prioritizing becomes really important.